Let us imagine that in the time of Emperor Rudolph, cameras such as those that immortalized Jimmy Carter already existed, and that they filmed the feast at the Emperor's court, during which Tycho Brahe writhed in his chair, turned pale, crossed and uncrossed his legs, and stared at the ceiling with glazed eyes. If on top of everything he had been aware that he was being watched by several million spectators, his torments would have been even greater, and the laughter echoing in the corridors of his immortality would sound even louder. People would surely demand that the film about the famous astronomer who was ashamed to urinate be broadcast every New Year's Eve, when everybody feels like laughing and there's seldom anything to laugh about. This notion arouses in me a question. Has the character of immortality changed in the epoch of cameras? I can answer that without hesitation. Essentially, no, for the photographic lens had existed long before it was invented. It existed as its own non-materialized essence. Even when no lens was aimed at them, people already behaved as if they were being photographed. No crowd of photographers ever scampered around Goethe, but the shadows of photographers projecting from the depths of the future did scamper around him. This happened, for example, in the course of his famous audience with Napoleon. The emperor, then at the peak of his career, gathered in a conference at Erfurt all the European rulers who were to endorse the division of power between himself and the emperor of the Russians. Napoleon was a true Frenchman in that he was not satisfied with sending hundreds of thousands to their death, but wanted, in addition, to be admired by writers. He asked his cultural advisor to name the most significant intellectual figures of contemporary Germany. And he learned that the foremost was a certain Mr. Goethe. Goethe! Napoleon tapped his forehead. The author of The Sorrows of Young Werther? During his Egyptian campaign, he found out that all his officers were immersed in that book. Because he knew the book himself, he got terribly angry. He berated the officers for reading such sentimental drivel and forbade them ever to lay their hands on another novel. Any novel. Let them read history books. That's far more useful. On the present occasion, however, satisfied that he knew who Goethe was, he decided to invite him. Indeed, he was quite happy to do so, because his advisor informed him that Goethe was famous above all as an author of plays. In contrast to novels, Napoleon appreciated the theater. It reminded him of battles. And because he himself was one of the greatest authors of battles, as well as their unsurpassed director, he was convinced in his heart of hearts that he was also the greatest tragic poet of all time, greater than Sophocles, greater than Shakespeare. The cultural advisor was a competent man, yet he often got things mixed up. True, Goethe was greatly interested in the theater, but his fame had less to do with that. In the mind of Napoleon's advisor, Goethe had apparently merged with Friedrich Schiller. Since Schiller was closely associated with Goethe, it was, after all, not too big a mistake to unite the two friends into one poet. It may even be possible that the advisor had acted quite deliberately, led by the laudable didactic intention of synthesizing German classicism for Napoleon's benefit into the single figure of Friedrich Johann Goethe. When Goethe, without any inkling that he was Goethe, received the invitation, he knew that he had to accept. He was exactly 1 year short of 60. Death was approaching, and with death also immortality. For as I said, death and immortality form an inseparable pair, more perfect than Marx and Engels, Romeo and Juliet, Laurel and Hardy. And Goethe had to consider that he was being invited to an audience with an immortal. Even though he was at that time deeply involved with the theory of colors, which he regarded as the high point of all his work, He abandoned his desk and left for Erfurt, where, on October 2nd, 1808, an unforgettable meeting between the immortal commander and the immortal poet took place. By the way, this classical music is really good, and it's apparently by a composer named Diamond, like the gem. And the piece is called Rounds for String Orchestra. Rounds like a circle. Rounds for String Orchestra. Gerard Schwartz is the conductor, and it's the Seattle Symphony. Diamond, Rounds for String Orchestra. Gerard Schwartz, conductor, Seattle Symphony. It is a jam. I think it's going to change right. Turn it up. All right. Surrounded by the restless shadows of photographers, Goethe climbs the broad staircase. He is accompanied by Napoleon's aide, who leads him up another staircase and down a series of corridors into a large salon. At the far end, Napoleon is sitting at a round table eating his breakfast. All around, bustling men in uniform hand him various reports, to which he gives brief answers as he munches. Only after a few minutes have passed does the aide dare to indicate Goethe, who is standing motionless at a distance. Napoleon glances at him and slides his right hand under his jacket, so that his palm touches the bottom left rib. In the past, he used to do this because he suffered from stomach pains, but later he developed a liking for the gesture and automatically sought recourse to it when he saw himself surrounded by photographers. He quickly swallows a morsel. It is not good to be photographed when the face is distorted by chewing, because newspapers maliciously publish just such photographs, and says loudly for everyone to hear, "Voilà un homme! There is a man." That is precisely the kind of pronouncement nowadays called a, quote, soundbite, end of quote. Politicians make long speeches in which they keep shamelessly repeating the same thing, knowing that it makes no difference whether they repeat themselves or not, since the general public will never get to learn more than the few words journalists cite from the speeches. In order to facilitate the journalists' work and to manipulate the approach a little, politicians insert into their ever more identical speeches one or two concise, witty phrases that they have never used before. And this in itself is so unexpected and astounding that the phrases immediately become famous. The whole art of politics these days lies not in running the polis, which runs itself by the logic of its own dark and uncontrollable mechanism, but in thinking up, quote, sound bites, end of quote, by which the politician is seen and understood, measured in opinion polls, and elected or rejected in elections. Goethe is not yet familiar with the term soundbite, but as we know, things exist in their essence even before they are materially realized and named. Goethe recognizes that the words Napoleon has just said were an outstanding soundbite, destined to prove very useful to both of them. He is pleased and takes a step closer to Napoleon's table. You can say what you like about the immortality of poets, but military commanders are even more immortal, so it is quite fitting that it is Napoleon who poses questions to Goethe, rather than the other way around. "How old are you?" he asks. 60, Goethe answers. "For that age you look fine," says Napoleon, with approbation. He is 20 years younger. And Goethe is flattered. When he was 50, he was terribly fat and had a double chin, and this didn't bother him very much. But as his years increased, the thought of death recurred more and more frequently, and he began to realize that he might enter immortality with a hideous paunch. He therefore decided to lose weight and soon became a slender man, no longer handsome, but at least capable of evoking memories of his former good looks. "Are you married?" Napoleon asks, full of sincerity. "Yes," answers Goethe with a slight bow. "Any children?" "One son." At that moment, a general leans toward Napoleon and announces an important piece of information. Napoleon becomes thoughtful. He pulls his hand out from under his waistcoat, picks up a scrap of meat with his fork, puts it in his mouth. The scene is no longer being photographed, and answers with his mouth full. It's a while before he remembers Goethe. Full of sincerity, he puts the question, "Are you married?" "Yes," answers Goethe with a slight bow. "Any children?" "One son," Goethe answers. "And tell me about Karl August." Napoleon suddenly fires off at the name of Goethe's ruler, Prince of the Weimar state, and from his tone it is obvious that he doesn't like the man. Goethe cannot speak ill of his lord, yet neither can he argue with an immortal, so he merely says with diplomatic evasiveness that Karl August has done a great deal for art and science. This reference to art and science gives the immortal commander an opportunity to stop chewing, get up from the table, stick his arm under his waistcoat, take a few steps toward the poet, and launch into a speech about the theater. At that moment, the invisible crowd of photographers comes to life, cameras begin to click, and the commander, who has taken the poet aside for an intimate conversation, has to raise his voice so that everyone in the hall can hear him. He suggests to Goethe that he write a play about the Erfurt Conference, which is about to guarantee at last an era of peace and happiness for humanity. "The theater," he says very loudly, "should become the school of the people." Already the second beautiful soundbite for tomorrow's newspapers. "And it would be an excellent idea," he adds in a softer voice, "if you dedicated this play to the Emperor Alexander." This indeed was the man the Erfurt Conference was about. This was the man Napoleon needed to win over. And then he goes on to give Gert Schill a short lecture on literature. In the course of it, he is interrupted by reports from aides and loses the thread of his thought. In order to find it, he repeats twice more, out of context and without conviction, the words, "Theater, school of the people," and then, yes, finally, he has found the thread. He mentions Voltaire's The Death of Caesar. According to Napoleon, this is an example of the way a dramatic poet missed an opportunity to become a teacher of the people. He should have shown in this play how that great commander worked for the well-being of humanity and how only the destined short span of his life prevented him from fulfilling his aims. The last words sound melancholy, and the commander looks the poet in the eye. "Behold, a great theme for you." But then he is interrupted again. High-ranking officers enter the hall. Napoleon pulls his arm out from under his waistcoat, sits down at the table, picks up a piece of meat with his fork, and chews, listening to reports. The shades of photographers disappear from the hall. Goethe looks around. He examines the pictures on the walls. Then he approaches the aide who brought him here and asks him whether he is to consider the audience over. The aide nods. A fork delivers a piece of meat to Napoleon's mouth, and Goethe departs.